Donald Trump hasn't issued a new executive order. There hasn't been a major Supreme Court ruling. Congress hasn't rewritten federal law. And yet federal power is being tested, not in courtrooms, but in the streets. That shift is the story. In theory, the United States resolves conflict through institutions. Courts interpret the law, elections confer authority, agencies enforce rules. That structure still exists. But right now, pressure is bypassing it. Across the country, protests and public reaction are shaping how federal authority is exercised before judges rule, before cases conclude, and before formal processes play out. That tells us something important has changed. Trump's presence in American politics is part of this context. Not because he controls these protests, but because his political era reshaped how people understand power. It taught Americans that outcomes don't always wait for process. That lesson stuck. What we're seeing now isn't a rejection of courts. It's a loss of patience with them. Legal systems move slowly by design. They prioritize evidence, procedure, and restraint. Public emotion does not. When people feel urgency, delay feels like denial. That gap between urgency and process is where street pressure emerges. Federal agencies understand this gap. They feel it every time an enforcement action becomes symbolic. Every time a routine decision is interpreted as a political signal. Every time silence is read as intent. This is why federal power is being tested outside the legal system, not because the courts have failed, but because people no longer believe courts move fast enough to protect legitimacy. Trump's political style accelerated this belief. He compressed time. He normalized immediate reaction. He trained both supporters and critics to expect confrontation, not patience. So when conflict arises now, people don't wait for rulings, they mobilize. From the outside, this can look like disorder. From the inside, institutions see something else. They see pressure before adjudication. That pressure doesn't overturn laws, it reshapes behavior. Federal agencies aren't abandoning the courts. They're adjusting their actions to avoid escalation before courts weigh in. That's a crucial distinction. This adjustment happens quietly, in timing decisions, in communication strategy, in how forcefully authority is exercised. None of that requires a vote, none of that requires a ruling, but it changes outcomes. This is how street pressure tests power, not by defying the law, but by changing the cost of enforcing it. Trump's continued relevance intensifies this test. Every federal action is interpreted through a political lens. Even neutrality feels partisan, even restraint feels strategic. So institutions hesitate, they calculate, they weigh reaction alongside legality. This isn't weakness. It's survival in a polarized environment. But survival has consequences. When power hesitates too often, people notice. They learn where leverage exists, and once people learn that leverage lives outside the courts, they return to it. This is why protests don't need to be violent to matter. They don't need demands to be effective. They need visibility. Visibility creates accountability pressure. Accountability pressure changes behavior. That's the quiet chain reaction unfolding right now. In the next part, we'll look at why institutions are more sensitive to street legitimacy than legal legitimacy, how public reaction shapes enforcement before judges speak, and why this dynamic is becoming permanent, not temporary. Because when power is tested outside the courts, the system doesn't collapse. It adapts. And adaptation changes everything. Why institutions fear street legitimacy. More than legal legitimacy. Federal power has always depended on law, but law alone has never been enough. What sustains authority is legitimacy, the belief that power is being exercised fairly, proportionally, and with restraint. Right now, that belief is being tested in public, not in court. Courts decide what is legal, streets reveal what is accepted, and institutions understand the difference. A court ruling can uphold authority, but public rejection can weaken it immediately. That's why agencies are responding to protest pressure even before judges speak. This doesn't mean institutions are ignoring the law. It means they are prioritizing social stability alongside legality. That priority has grown stronger in recent years. Trump's political era played a role in this shift, not because of one policy, but because it demonstrated how quickly legitimacy can fracture. Institutions learned that legal authority doesn't automatically translate into public acceptance. That lesson changed behavior. Federal agencies now ask a different set of questions before acting. Not just, is this lawful? But, how will this be perceived? How fast will reaction spread? What happens if this becomes symbolic? Those questions didn't dominate decision-making a decade ago. They do now. Street pressure forces institutions to think in real time. Courts think in months, sometimes years. Public reaction moves in hours. That mismatch reshapes enforcement. This is why power is being tested outside the courts, because reaction arrives before rulings, and reaction can't be appealed. Institutions fear one thing above all else: loss of voluntary compliance. When people stop believing authority is legitimate, enforcement becomes harder, costlier, and riskier. No court can fix that quickly. That's why agencies adjust behavior when protests appear. Even peaceful ones, especially peaceful ones. Peaceful protests signal something powerful. They signal that anger is organized, visible, and patient. That's more threatening to legitimacy than chaos. Violence isolates movements. Peace expands them. Institutions know this. So when protests remain calm but persistent, officials pay close attention. They see not disorder, but credibility erosion. Trump's continued political presence intensifies this sensitivity, because every enforcement decision can be framed as political alignment or opposition. Neutrality becomes fragile. That fragility pushes institutions toward caution. Caution becomes restraint. Restraint changes outcomes. This is how street legitimacy quietly overtakes legal legitimacy, not by overruling the courts, but by shaping behavior before courts act. Here's the critical insight. Once institutions begin responding to street legitimacy, they can't easily stop, because stopping looks provocative. If agencies suddenly revert to strict enforcement after showing restraint, it feels like punishment. If they maintain restraint, it feels like concession. Either way, pressure remains. That's why officials feel trapped. They're balancing law on one side and legitimacy on the other. This balance doesn't resolve cleanly. It becomes the new normal. People sense this. They see that reaction influences behavior. They see that visibility creates leverage. They learn where power lives. And once people learn that power responds to pressure, not rulings, they use pressure again, not because they reject the courts, but because the courts feel distant. This is the structural shift underway. Power hasn't left the legal system, but it's no longer contained by it. In the final part, we'll look at what this means for the future, whether institutions can rebuild legitimacy without surrendering authority, whether this shift stabilizes democracy or strains it. And what happens when street pressure becomes a permanent test of federal power? Because this moment isn't temporary, it's formative. It's survival in a polarized environment. But survival has consequences. When power hesitates too often, people notice. They learn where leverage exists, and once people learn that leverage lives outside the courts, they return to it. This is why protests don't need to be violent to matter. They don't need demands to be effective. They need visibility. Visibility creates accountability pressure. Accountability pressure changes behavior. That's the quiet chain reaction unfolding right now. In the next part, we'll look at why institutions are more sensitive to street legitimacy than legal legitimacy, how public reaction shapes enforcement before judges speak, and why this dynamic is becoming permanent, not temporary. Because when power is tested outside the courts, the system doesn't collapse, it adapts, and adaptation changes everything. What happens when federal power is tested? Outside the courts, when federal power begins responding more to street pressure than legal process, the system doesn't break, it bends, and bending changes how authority works. The real question now isn't whether courts still matter, they do. The question is whether courts are still where legitimacy is decided first. Because right now, legitimacy is being decided earlier as in public reaction. Federal institutions understand something crucial. A court ruling can validate authority, but it cannot restore trust once it's lost. Trust moves faster than law, and right now, trust is fragile. That's why agencies are responding to protests even before judges speak, not because they fear the courts, but because they fear losing voluntary compliance. Voluntary compliance is the invisible glue of governance. When people comply because they believe authority is fair, systems function smoothly. When that belief weakens, enforcement becomes harder, riskier, and more expensive. No court order can fix that quickly. Donald Trump's political era accelerated this reality, not because he dismantled institutions, but because he exposed how quickly legitimacy can collapse when authority feels confrontational. Institutions learned a hard lesson. Law without trust is brittle. That lesson still guides decisions today, even when Trump isn't speaking, even when he isn't directly involved. So power adapts. It hesitates more. It explains less confidently. It calculates reaction alongside legality. This isn't surrender, it's survival. But survival has a cost. When authority bends too often, it teaches people something. That pressure works. That visibility matters more than patience. That reaction precedes explanation. Once that lesson is learned, it doesn't disappear. It becomes part of political culture. This is why moments like this don't fade quietly. They set precedents, not legal precedents, behavioral ones. Future protests don't start from zero. They start from memory. Memory of what moved institutions before. That's the long-term implication. Not instability, but reprogramming. Institutions now face a delicate choice. Rebuild trust through transparency and acknowledgement, or manage pressure defensively. One stabilizes legitimacy. The other preserves control temporarily. History suggests legitimacy lasts longer than control, but legitimacy takes courage. It requires speaking before certainty, acknowledging tension before resolution, treating public reaction as a signal, not a threat. If institutions can do that, street pressure becomes dialogue. If they can't, pressure becomes the default language of influence. And once that happens, courts still matter, but they no longer come first. That's the test unfolding right now, not of law, but of governance. Federal power isn't being overthrown. It's being measured by trust, measured by reaction speed, measured by whether people still believe waiting is worth it. If that belief returns, the system stabilizes. If it doesn't, pressure becomes permanent. That's why this moment matters. Not because of how loud it is, but because of where power is being tested. Not in courtrooms, but in public space. And once power learns where it's being tested, it never forgets. It's survival in a polarized environment. But survival has consequences. When power hesitates too often, people notice. They learn where leverage exists, and once people learn that leverage lives outside the courts, they return to it. This is why protests don't need to be violent to matter. They don't need demands to be effective. They need visibility. Visibility creates accountability pressure. Accountability pressure changes behavior. That's the quiet chain reaction unfolding right now. In the next part, we'll look at why institutions are more sensitive to street legitimacy than legal legitimacy, how public reaction shapes enforcement before judges speak, and why this dynamic is becoming permanent, not temporary. Because when power is tested outside the courts, the system doesn't collapse. It adapts, and adaptation changes everything.